I opened my mail the way I always did. Half-distracted keys still in my hand, already thinking about what needed to be done next until one line stopped my brain cold. Paid in full. It was printed in bold, perfectly centered in the plastic window of the envelope, clean and confident like it belonged to someone else's life. Not mine, not my house, not my mortgage. For a few seconds I just stood there in the entryway, the weight of the mail resting against my forearm, my keys digging into my palm. My mind refused to translate what my eyes were seeing. My mortgage didn't vanish. It couldn't. I still owed more than $200,000. I hadn't made any lump payment. I hadn't signed anything. I hadn't even spoken to my lender that week. I flipped the envelope over, then back again like the explanation might appear if I looked hard enough. It didn't. The letter was cheerful, almost congratulatory, thanking me for my final payment and confirming the release of the lien on my property. That was the moment fear arrived. Not relief, not excitement. Fear. The quiet kind that settles deep, the kind that tells you someone has moved inside your life without asking. I did what anyone would do. I called my dad. He answered on the second ring. I told him what I was holding. There was a pause on the line, just long enough to feel measured. Then he gasped and said, "What? That's impossible." And right after that, my phone rang again. A payoff file representative. My name is Lauren Hayes. I was 32 years old, then standing alone in the house I had bought 3 years earlier with my own credit, my own savings, and a mortgage I tracked like a habit. Automatic payments. Monthly statements. Nothing missed, nothing deferred. This house was the first thing I ever owned that no one could threaten to take away. Or so I thought. I closed the front door behind me and leaned against it, the letter still in my hand, while the second call went to voicemail. My dad's voice echoed in my head. The words he'd chosen were right, the timing wasn't. He'd moved too quickly to certainty, too quickly to dismissal, like someone shutting a door before a draft could get in. I listened to the voicemail. Polite, professional. The representative confirmed my loan had been satisfied and asked me to call back to complete routine follow-up. Routine. That word didn't belong anywhere near what I was feeling. I called my dad again. "I just got a message from the lender," I said, keeping my voice even. "They say the payoff was processed yesterday." "Well, then it's clearly a mistake," he replied immediately. Too immediately. "Banks do that sometimes. You shouldn't stress yourself out." "I'm planning to go in tomorrow," I said. There was a beat. "Why would you do that? Just call them. There's no need to make it bigger than it is." I stared at the wall across from me, the place where a framed photo of my closing day still hung. Me smiling, holding the key like it meant safety. "I'll let you know what they say," I told him, and ended the call. If you're listening to this, stay with me. What looked like good news was the start of something else entirely, and the only reason I got out ahead of it was because I didn't treat it like a miracle. I treated it like evidence. The letter said my loan had been satisfied. It said a release of lien had been executed. Executed. That word stuck. Yesterday afternoon, while I was at work, someone had moved paper through a system that doesn't ask questions once the right boxes are checked. I opened my lender's app. My login still worked. My mortgage didn't appear at 0. It wasn't there at all. The account was closed, archived, finalized. That difference mattered. Paid off means finished. Closed means processed. Closed means someone pushed it all the way through. I took photos of the letter on my kitchen counter, the date visible on my phone screen. I saved the voicemails. I wrote down the time of each call. I did not text my dad. Confrontation gives manipulators room to improvise. Paper doesn't. If you've ever felt that moment when something good turns wrong in your hands, you know the feeling I'm talking about. It's the instant you realize this isn't about luck. It's about control. I slept that night, but not deeply. I woke before my alarm, already dressed in my mind, already rehearsing the words I would use. Not accusations, not questions, statements. I did not authorize a payoff. I did not sign anything. I am the borrower. If you want to know how this unfolded, how a single forged signature can set an entire machine in motion, and how close I came to losing my home before I understood what was happening, follow the story. Stay with me. And if stories about truth boundaries and consequences matter to you, consider subscribing. You're not alone here. By the time I pulled into the lender's parking lot the next morning, I understood one thing clearly. Whatever had happened to my mortgage, my father already knew more about it than I did. And that was only the beginning. The house didn't look any different the next morning, and that somehow made it worse. Sunlight came through the kitchen window the same way it always did. The coffee maker hummed. The floorboards didn't creak any louder than usual. Nothing in the room reflected what had shifted underneath my feet, and that disconnect kept my nerves tight as wire. I replayed my father's voice while I stood at the counter staring at my phone. The pause before he answered, the speed of his denial, the way he'd tried to shut the whole thing down before I could even ask a second question. What? That's impossible. People say impossible when they mean unlikely. He'd said it like a conclusion. I picked up my phone and called him again, not because I wanted reassurance, but because I wanted consistency. If this was truly a mistake, his story wouldn't need adjusting. He answered quickly. Too quickly. I'm heading out now, I said. I'm going to stop by the lender this morning. There it was again. A breath in. A pause. Lauren, why are you doing that? It's unnecessary. These things sort themselves out. I just want to see the file. I replied, It'll take 10 minutes. You're overthinking it, he said gently, the way he always did when he wanted me to doubt myself. You've been stressed lately. You know that. The words were familiar. Concern framed as diagnosis. Protection framed as authority. I'll call you after, I said, and ended the call before he could say anything else. I stood there for a moment with my phone in my hand, feeling the echo of that sentence settle into place. You've been stressed lately. It wasn't comfort. It was positioning. I opened my lender's app again, even though I already knew what I'd see. The dashboard loaded, checking account, savings, credit card, no mortgage, not listed as paid, not listed as zero, just gone. I clicked into the help section, searched for closed account, and read the explanation twice. Closed accounts are finalized and removed from active management. Records are archived. Archived meant completed. Completed meant processed. Processed meant approved. My payments were automatic. They had been since the first month. I knew the balance within a few $100s at any given time because I checked it the way some people check the weather. There was no scenario where I forgot to pay off $200,000 overnight. This wasn't a miracle. It was an override. I sat down at the table and called the payoff department back the number printed on the letter. The representative answered with the same calm tone as the voicemail her voice trained to reassure. I'm calling about my mortgage account, I said. I received a paid in full notice, but I did not authorize a payoff. There was a brief pause as she pulled up the file, keys clicking. Silence stretching just long enough to feel deliberate. I see the payoff here, she said. It was processed yesterday afternoon. I didn't make that payment, I replied. It came through as a standard borrower payoff, she said, still neutral. Everything looks complete. I didn't sign anything I said. And I didn't submit a request. Another pause. Longer this time. The payoff file includes a borrower authorization, she said carefully. Signed. Signed. That word landed differently coming from someone else's mouth. What date, I asked. Yesterday, she replied. Mid-afternoon. I glanced at the calendar on my wall, even though I knew the answer. Yesterday, I'd been at work all day. Meetings, badge logs, cameras, a timeline that could be proved. Can you tell me how the authorization was submitted? I asked. She hesitated. For more detail, you'd need to speak with someone in person or submit a formal inquiry. That was the first crack. The moment the script stopped fitting. Okay, I said. I'll be there this morning. She didn't argue. She didn't reassure me this time. She just confirmed the office hours and ended the call. I didn't call my father back. I didn't text him. I didn't explain what I was thinking. I took photos of the letter again, this time next to that day's newspaper, and saved screenshots of my account page showing the closed status. If someone had signed my name, I wanted the record clean and uncontaminated. On the drive over, I kept replaying one detail. My father hadn't asked a single question. Not how much the payoff was, not who processed it, not when it happened, just impossible, and let it go. That wasn't curiosity, that was containment. The lender's office sat in a strip of glass and steel buildings designed to look calm. Soft colors, muted lighting, background music meant to make panic feel embarrassing. I took a number and waited, watching the screen cycle through names while my pulse stayed steady. When my number was called, I followed a man in a blue shirt down a short hallway into a small office. He gestured for me to sit and turned his monitor slightly away from the door. "How can I help you today?" he asked. "I received a paid-in-full notice for my mortgage," I said. "I did not authorize a payoff and I did not sign any documents." He nodded once and began typing. The room went quiet except for the hum of the computer. I watched his face as the file loaded. The change was subtle but unmistakable. His posture shifted. His eyes narrowed just slightly. "Okay," he said slowly. "I see the payoff." "I didn't make it," I repeated. "I understand," he replied, still looking at the screen. "The funds were wired and the lien release was processed right after." "Who authorized it?" I asked. He turned the monitor toward me. "The file includes a borrower authorization and satisfaction request," he said. "Signed." The document filled the screen. My name typed neatly at the top, a signature at the bottom that was supposed to be mine. It wasn't. It was close enough to fool someone who didn't know my handwriting. Close enough to pass a glance, but wrong in ways I felt immediately. The pressure was off. The curves were hesitant. It looked drawn, not written. "I didn't sign that," I said. He leaned closer, zoomed in. The signature grew larger, the edges jagged from the scan. His face went still. "This was notarized," he said quietly. My stomach dropped slow and cold. "Yesterday," he added. Notarized meant someone had stood behind that signature and certified it. It meant the system believed I had been present. I took a breath and kept my voice even. Then someone committed fraud. He didn't disagree. He just nodded, once the way people do when a file changes categories in their mind. "Let me escalate this," he said. "We'll need compliance involved." As he stood and stepped out of the room, I sat alone with the monitor still glowing in front of me, my forged name filling the screen. If someone had signed for me, they hadn't just crossed a line. They'd left a trail. And I was about to follow it. The man didn't leave me alone for long. When he came back into the office, he wasn't by himself. A woman followed him in, hair pulled back tight, a tablet held flat against her chest like it was part of her. She didn't smile. She didn't introduce herself right away. She looked at the screen first, then at me. "Ms. Hayes," she said finally. "I'm with internal compliance." That word settled heavier than anything else I'd heard so far. Compliance meant the file had crossed a line. It meant this wasn't customer service anymore. She didn't ask me how I felt. She asked me questions. "You're stating you did not authorize a payoff," she said. "You did not sign this document. And you were not present before a notary yesterday." "Yes," I replied. She nodded once and turned back to the screen. "Can you confirm where you were yesterday afternoon?" "At work," I said. "All day. Badge access. Cameras." She typed something quickly, then looked up again. "Do you recognize the notary name on this document?" I leaned forward as she enlarged the notary certificate. The stamp was clean, professional. The name printed below it was one I hadn't heard in years, but I knew exactly why it made my throat tighten. Margaret Lane. I didn't react outwardly. I just stared at the screen. Yes, I said. I know that name. The compliance officer's eyes lifted slightly. How? She's a notary my father mentioned over the years, I replied, whenever paperwork came up. He always said she was efficient. The word efficient sounded different now. It sounded like a euphemism. The officer nodded again, slower this time. Was this notarization done in person or remotely? The man at the desk clicked into another tab. Remote online notarization, he said. RON. That single detail changed the shape of everything. Remote notarizations aren't casual. They aren't favors done at kitchen tables. They require identity verification, credential checks, and a live video session. They create records that can't be hand-waved away. Is there a recording, I asked? Yes, the compliance officer replied, and an audit trail. I felt something settle into place inside my chest. Not relief, certainty. If someone had impersonated me, they hadn't just forged my signature. They'd done it on camera. The man clicked again, scrolling. The authorization was submitted with an email address, he said. I recognized the pause before he continued. It's not the email we have on file for you. What email is it? I asked. He read it aloud. It wasn't mine. Close, but not quite. A variation that looked legitimate if you weren't looking closely. The kind of detail meant to slide through unnoticed. And where were the payoff confirmation documents sent, the compliance officer asked. He scrolled further. His shoulders stiffened. It lists a different mailing address, he said. I already knew the answer before he said it. That was the worst part. When patterns become predictable. He read it anyway. It was my father's address. No explanation could soften that. No misunderstanding could cover it. Legal documents had been deliberately routed away from me and toward him. This is enough to open a formal fraud investigation, the compliance officer said. We're placing an internal hold on the file, but the loan is already paid off, the man said, glancing at her. The account is closed. Closed doesn't mean irreversible, she replied. It means processed. We can still flag the release as disputed. She turned to me. Ms. Hayes, I need you to understand something. If someone forged your signature and completed a notarized authorization in your name, that's criminal. Our priority right now is preserving evidence. What kind of evidence, I asked. All of it, she said. The RON video, audit logs, IP addresses, submission metadata. We're also pulling call logs related to this payoff. Call logs, I repeated. The man cleared his throat. There's a note in the file, he admitted. Someone called payoff services yesterday to confirm procedures. The compliance officer didn't hesitate. Print it. He hesitated for half a second longer, then clicked. The printer behind him whirred to life. When the page slid out, I didn't rush to read it. I waited until he handed it to me. The phone number at the top belonged to my father. I folded the paper carefully and placed it on top of the growing stack in front of me. Evidence had weight now. Literal weight. We'll issue a dispute notice to the county recorder if the lien release is recorded, the compliance officer said. And we'll provide you with a certified fraud packet. Has the release been recorded yet? I asked. The man checked. It was submitted for recording yesterday. It's pending county processing. Pending meant not final. Yet. Where did the payoff funds come from? I asked. The compliance officer glanced at the screen, then back at me. A third-party account, she said. An escrow company. That word sat between us, heavy and precise. Escrow isn't used to pay off your own mortgage. It's used to move property. Someone hadn't cleared my debt to help me. They'd cleared it to remove an obstacle. The compliance officer handed me her card. If you see any other filings, or if anyone contacts you about a transfer, call me immediately. I will, I said. She paused at the door. One more thing. Don't confront your father yet. I nodded. I had no intention of giving him the chance to rewrite the story. After they left me alone again, I gathered the documents slowly. The forged authorization, the notary certificate, the call log. Each piece fit too cleanly to be coincidence. I sat there for a moment, staring at my name written in someone else's hand. If this had been a mistake, it would have stopped at the bank. It wouldn't have required a notary my father knew. It wouldn't have rerouted mail. It wouldn't have involved escrow. This was coordinated. I stood, walked out of the office, and stepped back into the parking lot. The sky looked the same. Cars moved normally. People went about their days unaware that a quiet crime had unfolded inside a glass building 10 minutes earlier. My phone buzzed in my hand. Dad. I didn't answer. I already knew the truth now. The signature wasn't mine. The authorization wasn't mine. And the person who benefited from every step of it hadn't even bothered to hide. Someone had used my name to open a door. And I was about to find out what they'd walked through. The name sat on the screen longer than the signature had. Margaret Lane. It appeared beneath the digital stamp in clean black text, perfectly aligned, professional, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what it meant. I knew exactly what it meant. I didn't react right away. I didn't need to. Recognition doesn't always arrive with emotion. Sometimes it arrives with certainty. I know that notary, I said, finally. The compliance officer looked at me again, this time differently. Not curious, measuring. How, she asked. She's someone my father has mentioned for years, I replied. Whenever paperwork came up. Estate documents, old property issues. He always said she could get things done quickly, efficiently, the kind of words people use when they don't want to explain details. The man at the desk clicked into another tab and pulled up the notarization certificate. The digital seal loaded line by line, commission number, county, expiration date. Everything looked correct. Was this notarized in person or remotely, I asked. He checked the submission details. Remote online notarization, he said. The room felt smaller after that. Remote notarization isn't informal. It isn't someone scribbling a signature and stamping it later. It requires a live video session, identity verification, credential checks, a recorded interaction that can be reviewed frame by frame. Is there a video, I asked? Yes, the compliance officer said. And an audit trail. I didn't let myself exhale. I didn't let myself hope. But I felt the shift. Someone hadn't just forged my name. They'd done it in a way that assumed no one would look too closely. The man scrolled again. The RON certificate includes session metadata, he said. Email address used for the verification. He paused, then read it aloud. It wasn't mine. It was close enough to pass at a glance. Same name, different domain. The kind of variation meant to look intentional rather than fraudulent. That's not my email, I said. We can see that the compliance officer replied. It doesn't match your borrower profile. She tapped her tablet once, then looked back up. And where were the payoff confirmation documents sent? He scrolled further. His expression tightened just slightly. There's a return address listed, he said. He read it. It was my father's house. Not a forwarding request. Not an error. A deliberate entry. Legal documents meant for me had been routed to him. That was the moment the last remaining doubt collapsed. There was no version of events where this was meant to help me. You don't reroute someone's legal mail unless you intend to act before they do. This is sufficient to open a formal fraud investigation, the compliance officer said. We're placing a hold on any further processing. But the lien release was already submitted, the man said. The account is closed. Closed doesn't mean final, she replied. It means processed. We can flag the release as disputed and notify the recorder if it hasn't been indexed. She turned to me. Hayes were preserving the entire file. The RON video, the audit logs, IP addresses, submission data, all of it. I nodded. Thank you. She paused, then added, We're also pulling call logs associated with the payoff. I looked up. Call logs. The man hesitated, then cleared his throat. There's an internal note, he admitted. Someone called yesterday to confirm payoff procedures. The compliance officer didn't look at him. Print it. The printer whirred to life again. The sound was sharp in the quiet room. When the page slid out, I took it without rushing. I read the number at the top once. I didn't need to read it twice. It was my father's phone number. He hadn't just known what was happening. He had orchestrated it. I folded the paper carefully and placed it on top of the others. The stack was growing now. Each page a step someone had taken without me. Where did the payoff funds originate? I asked. The compliance officer glanced at the screen. A third-party account, she said. An escrow company. Escrow. That word didn't belong anywhere near my mortgage. Borrowers don't use escrow to pay off their own loans. Escrow exists to move property, not clear debt. This wasn't an ending. It was a setup. If the lien release is recorded, I said what happens next. She met my eyes. Then the title is free to move. Free. Clean. Transferable. I thought about the timing. The forged signature. The notary my father knew. The rerouted mail. The escrow funds. Every piece pointed in the same direction. Someone was clearing the path. We'll issue a dispute notice to the county recorder immediately, the compliance officer said, and we'll provide you with a certified fraud packet. You should also consider legal counsel. I will, I said. She handed me her card. If anyone contacts you about a transfer or sale, call me, and don't confront your father yet. I won't, I replied. I meant it. When they left me alone again, I gathered the documents slowly. I didn't rush. Panic leads to mistakes, and I didn't have room for any. I stepped out of the office and into the parking lot. The sky was bright, indifferent. Cars passed. People went about their lives without knowing that a house had nearly changed hands without its owner ever touching a pen. My phone buzzed. Dad. I let it ring. Then a text followed. Don't stress yourself out. This is for your own good. I stared at the screen until the words lost their shape. For your own good. That was always the phrase. The justification. The permission slip people write themselves when they decide your consent doesn't matter. I didn't respond. I saved the message. I took another photo of the document spread across my passenger seat before starting the car. If someone had paid off my mortgage as a gift, they wouldn't have hidden it. They wouldn't have forged my name. They wouldn't have used escrow. And they wouldn't have rushed. This wasn't help. It was positioning. By the time I pulled out of the lot, one thing was clear. My father hadn't done this to protect me. He'd done it to get ahead of me. And whatever he planned to do next, it wouldn't wait for permission. The address didn't belong to me. It was read aloud in the same neutral tone as everything else, just another line in a system that didn't care who it hurt. But the moment I heard it, something in my chest went still. That's not my address, I said. The man at the desk nodded once. It's listed as the return address for the recorded lien release. I didn't need him to explain what that meant. Legal documents don't wander. They're directed. Whoever receives them controls the next move. That address is my father's, I said. No one in the room tried to soften that. The compliance officer didn't apologize. She didn't speculate. She just tapped her tablet and added another note to a file that was already changing shape. That confirms intent, she said quietly. Intent. That was the word that mattered now. Mistakes don't reroute mail. Confusion doesn't substitute addresses. Someone had entered his information deliberately knowing that the first official notice wouldn't come to me. I pictured my mailbox at home empty and innocent while paperwork that affected my ownership traveled somewhere else entirely. It wasn't just deception. It was timing. Whoever held those documents would always be a step ahead. Where did the payoff funds come from? I asked. The compliance officer looked at the screen again. They originated from a third-party account. Whose I pressed. An escrow company, she replied. That single word reframed everything. Escrow isn't how homeowners pay off their own loans. Escrow exists to facilitate transfers to move property from one party to another cleanly, efficiently, and quickly. You use escrow when you're closing something, not when you're celebrating. My mortgage hadn't been paid to free me. It had been paid to free the house. So the lien was cleared, I said slowly, and the release was sent to my father. Yes, she confirmed. And the funds didn't come from me. No. I nodded, not because I accepted it, but because the picture was finally complete. The payoff wasn't the end of a debt. It was the removal of an obstacle. Has the lien release been recorded yet? I asked. The man checked the status. It was submitted for recording yesterday afternoon. It's pending county processing. Pending meant there was still time. Not much, but some. If it gets indexed, I said it becomes part of the public record. Yes, he replied. Undoing it after that requires court action. I took a breath and forced myself to slow down. Panic would make me sloppy, and sloppiness was what this plan relied on. I need copies of everything I said. The payoff summary, the authorization, the notary certificate, any audit metadata you can provide now. The compliance officer nodded. We'll prepare a certified fraud packet for you. It will include everything we're allowed to release at this stage. Thank you, I said. She paused, studying me. Ms. Hayes, I need to be clear. If someone is using escrow funds, clearing a lien, and rerouting documents, they're likely attempting a transfer. You should check the county recorder as soon as possible. I was already planning to, I replied. I gathered the documents they handed me and left the office without another word. The afternoon sun hit harder than it had that morning, bright and almost cruel in its normalcy. In the car, I laid the papers across the passenger seat and took another photo. The forged signature, the notary certificate, the call log, my father's address printed where mine should have been. My phone buzzed again. Dad. I didn't answer. Then a text appeared. I took care of it. You don't need to worry. I stared at the screen until the words felt small. Took care of it. As if the house was a loose end he'd tied up, not the place where I lived. I saved the message and started the engine. On the drive to the county recorder's office, everything clicked into place with unsettling clarity. Clearing the lien removed the bank's claim. Routing the release to my father gave him control of the next filing. Using escrow meant there was a transaction waiting on the other side. You don't prepare a runway unless you expect something to land. The recorder's office sat in a squat government building with faded signage and a parking lot that was always half full. Inside, the air smelled like paper and toner. People sat in rows of plastic chairs clutching folders like lifelines. When my number was called, I stepped to the counter and slid my ID forward. I need the most recent record history for my parcel, I said. I believe documents may have been recorded without my authorization. The clerk typed my address into his system. His fingers moved quickly, practiced. Then they slowed. He leaned closer to the screen. His brow creased. There was a recording yesterday, he said. My stomach tightened, but my voice stayed steady. What kind a satisfaction of mortgage, he replied. That confirmed what I already knew. I nodded once. And is there anything else, I asked. He hesitated. That was all the answer I needed. He scrolled again. The screen refreshed. He stopped typing. Yes, he said quietly. There's a deed. The word dropped like a stone. What kind of deed, I asked. A quitclaim, he replied. I didn't move. I didn't blink. To who, I asked. He scrolled to the grantee field and read the name. My father's. I closed my eyes for half a second, just long enough to absorb it, then opened them again. This wasn't about speculation anymore. It was recorded, filed, time-stamped. When was it recorded? I asked. Yesterday afternoon, he said. The same afternoon the lien release was submitted. The same afternoon my forged signature appeared. The same afternoon my father told me everything was impossible. Can I see it? I asked. He pulled the document up on the screen and zoomed in. My name appeared at the top, typed cleanly. The signature at the bottom was the same careful imitation I'd seen at the lender. The notary block loaded last. Margaret Lane. The same name, the same commission, the same day. I looked up at the clerk. I did not sign this, I said. I was not present. This is fraud. He nodded slowly. If that's the case, this becomes a legal matter, not a clerical one. I understand, I said. I need certified copies of everything recorded yesterday. And I need the submission metadata. How it was delivered. Who submitted it? He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. I'll get those for you. As the printer started up behind the counter, my phone buzzed again. Another message from my father. We need to talk. This is family. I didn't respond. Because it wasn't about family anymore. It was about ownership, about consent, about someone deciding that clearing my mortgage meant clearing me out of the way. When the clerk slid the certified copies across the counter, he didn't do it casually. He did it the way people hand over evidence. I took the papers, feeling their weight settle into my hands. On paper, my house no longer belonged to me. And if I didn't move faster than the plan already in motion, it wouldn't just be gone on paper for long. I didn't argue with the paperwork. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand explanations from the clerk that he wasn't authorized to give. I did the only thing that mattered in that moment. I asked for proof. I need certified copies, I said. Everything recorded yesterday. And I need the submission details. Who filed it? How it was delivered. The clerk studied my face for a beat, then nodded. His posture changed. Less transactional. More careful. I should warn you, he said quietly. If this deed is fraudulent, this becomes a criminal matter, not something we can correct internally. I know, I replied. That's exactly why I need the copies. He clicked through the system again and sent the documents to the printer. While it warmed up, he leaned closer to the screen, scanning the metadata. This was e-recorded, he said, submitted electronically through a third-party platform, by who I asked. He scrolled. His finger stopped. Submitting party listed as Northbridge Escrow. Escrow again. The same word the compliance officer had used at the lender. The same mechanism. The same trail. This wasn't improvised. It was coordinated. And the notary I asked, even though I already knew. He zoomed in on the acknowledgement page. The stamp sharpened. The name appeared. Margaret Lane. Same notary. Same day. Same lie repeated across systems that trusted each other by default. Do you see this often? I asked. He didn't answer right away. The printer whirred behind him, spitting out pages with official stamps and raised seals. More than you'd think, he said finally. Less than you'd hope. He slid the certified copies across the counter. A satisfaction of mortgage. A quitclaim deed transferring my property to my father. Time stamps from yesterday afternoon that aligned too neatly to be coincidence. Can we place a fraud alert on the parcel? I asked. Yes, he said, immediately. He handed me a form and a pen. I filled it out slowly, deliberately. I signed my name the way I always do when I'm calm, not the careful imitation someone else had tried to pass off as mine. While he processed the alert, I asked the next question that mattered. Is there anything else pending on this property? I said. Any new filings or inquiries? He checked the live queue. His eyes flicked to another line on the screen, then away. There's an inquiry, he said. From this morning. My throat tightened. What kind of inquiry? A title pull, he replied. Pre-close review. The words landed exactly where I expected them to. Pre-close means sale. It means someone was preparing to transfer ownership, not hypothetically, but imminently. It meant the payoff and the deed weren't the end game. They were the setup. From which company, I asked. He read the name. A local title company, not the one that handled my original purchase. Print that too, I said. He did without hesitation. By the time he finished, my folder was thick with proof. Certified documents. Metadata. A fraud alert confirmation that felt like a seatbelt in a car already sliding. Outside, the air felt heavier. My phone buzzed again as I stepped into the parking lot. Dad. Then a text. You're overreacting. This is safer this way. I stared at the message, then took a screenshot and saved it. Intent doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it slips out in reassurance. I didn't go home. Not yet. I sat in my car and opened the closing documents on my phone from when I bought the house. I found the title insurance policy and the contact number I'd never thought I'd need. When the woman answered, her voice was bright and practiced. That changed the moment I said the words she hears before everything shifts. I believe a forged deed has been recorded against my property, I said. The deed transfers my house to my father. There was a pause. Keys tapping. Her tone lowered. What's the property address, she asked. I gave it to her. More tapping. I see the recording, she said quietly. And I see the satisfaction of mortgage as well. Yes, I replied. The lender has opened an internal fraud case. The notary is Margaret Lane. The escrow company is Northbridge. The line went silent for half a second, the way it does when a name hits a system or a memory. Please hold, she said. I'm escalating you to claims. When a man picked up, his voice was measured, controlled. This is Daniel Ross, he said. Title claims. Tell me what happened. I told him everything. Clean, chronological, paid in full notice, forged authorization, remote notarization, rerouted mail, quit claim deed, pre-close inquiry. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he asked one question that cut through the noise. Do you still occupy the property, he asked. Yes, I said. Good, he replied. Then listen carefully. Do not leave. Do not let anyone in. If anyone shows up claiming to be a buyer, realtor, or contractor, you call the police immediately. So, there's a sale, I said. A pre-close inquiry strongly suggests that he replied. They move fast when they think they're racing the record. Racing the record. My father hadn't panicked. He'd executed. We're opening a title fraud claim, Daniel continued. We'll assign counsel today. You'll need to file a police report for forgery and for filing a false instrument. We'll also file an emergency action to cloud title. Today, I asked. Immediately, he said. I ended the call and started the engine. The police station was less dramatic than television makes it look. Fluorescent lights, scuffed floors, a front desk that had seen everything and reacted to none of it. When the officer asked what I was reporting, I placed my folder on the counter and said it plainly. A forged deed was recorded transferring my house to my father. The signature is not mine. The notarization is fraudulent, and an escrow company appears to be attempting a sale. His eyes sharpened as he flipped through the pages. The notary name, the recorder stamps, the timeline. Have a seat, he said. A detective came out a few minutes later. Plain clothes, calm voice. He introduced himself and asked me to start from the beginning. I did. When I finished, he studied the quitclaim deed for a long moment, then pointed to the notary block. Remote online notary, he said. That's good. For me, I asked. For the truth, he replied. There will be a recording. Logs. IP addresses. If it's not you on that video, this is felony level. The word felony didn't bring relief. It brought clarity. Can you stop the sale, I asked. We can try, he said. But we need the escrow details. I slid the e-recording receipt across the desk. Northbridge Escrow. He wrote it down. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. His expression changed just slightly. Ms. Hayes, he said, standing. You need to come with me. My stomach tightened. Why? Because he said already moving your father is at your house right now with a realtor telling the neighbors it's sold. I didn't ask how he knew. I stood, grabbed my folder, and followed the detective through a door marked Authorized Personnel Only. The hallway smelled like stale coffee and paper. He walked fast, not rushed the way people move when the decision has already been made. Listen carefully, he said as we reached his desk. Do not engage with your father. Do not explain. If he approaches you, you say one sentence only. This is an active fraud investigation. Speak to the detective. Then you stop. I understand, I said. He made one call on speaker. A patrol officer answered, breath quick, voice clipped. Confirm what you have, the detective said. Female matching the father's description is outside the residence with a realtor, the officer replied. They're telling neighbors the property is sold. No attempt to enter yet. My stomach went cold. Any attempt to make contact with the occupant, the detective asked. Not yet, the officer said. They're waiting for me. The detective looked at me. We're going now. We drove in his unmarked car without lights or sirens. The city passed in a blur of normal life that felt obscene. My phone buzzed again in my hand. Dad. Then a text. Open the door. We're finalizing. I screenshotted it and handed my phone to the detective. He glanced at it once and handed it back. This helps, he said. When we turned onto my street, I saw them immediately. My father stood on the sidewalk in a pressed jacket, hair neat, posture confident. Beside him was a man in a blazer holding a leather portfolio, his stance rehearsed professional. Across the street, my neighbor stood frozen on her porch phone, half-raised, eyes wide. My father straightened when the car stopped. He smiled already, preparing to perform. Then the detective stepped out first. The smile faltered. Not gone. Just misaligned. Elaine Hayes, the detective asked, flashing his badge briefly. My father blinked. Yes, he said. Who are you, Detective Miller? He replied. Property crimes. The realtor took a step back. His confidence evaporated in real time. Oh, this is ridiculous. My father laughed lightly. This is a family misunderstanding. No, the detective said calmly. It's an active investigation involving a forged deed and fraudulent notarization. My father's eyes widened theatrically. Forged. That's insane. She signed it. Stop, the detective said, holding up a hand. Not aggressive. Final. My father's mouth snapped shut, but his eyes stayed bright, searching for witnesses. The detective turned to the realtor. Identify yourself. Darren, he said, swallowing. Darren Cole, listing agent. Who hired you? The detective asked. I did. My father cut in quickly. I own the house now. Stop, the detective said again. Darren looked between them, then answered. Mr. Hayes retained me, said the property was transferred as part of family planning. The detective nodded, then asked the only question that mattered. Do you have an executed purchase agreement? He said. An escrow number. Buyer name. Darren hesitated. His eyes flicked to my father, waiting for instruction. That hesitation said everything. My father's voice rose sharp now. This is harassment. You're embarrassing me. You embarrassed yourself when you recorded a deed with a signature that doesn't belong to the homeowner, the detective replied. My father turned toward the neighbor across the street. She's unstable, he said loudly. She forgets things. She's always been emotional. The detective stepped closer, lowering his voice so it couldn't be used as a show. Mr. Hayes, he said, your daughter is inside her home. She is the legal occupant. You are not to contact her directly. You are not to attempt entry. I'm her father, my father snapped. That doesn't grant you title, the detective replied. He turned back to Darren. Sir, if you're participating in an attempted sale based on a forged instrument, you may be drawn into this as a witness. I suggest you provide the escrow details now. Darren's face drained of color. He opened his portfolio with shaking hands and pulled out a single page. An escrow intake summary. The detective took it without touching Darren's fingers and read it once. Northbridge Escrow. Buyer name partially redacted. Closing date circled. And one line near the bottom that made my stomach clench. Possession immediate upon recording. Immediate possession. My father hadn't just planned to sell the house. He'd planned to remove me from it the moment his paperwork became final. The detective folded the page and placed it into his folder. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "you are being detained pending further investigation." My father laughed sharp and brittle. "For what I paid her mortgage. I helped her." "Paying off a mortgage does not authorize forgery," the detective replied. A patrol car pulled up behind us. 2 officers stepped out quietly, efficiently. The neighborhood watched without speaking. My father's confidence cracked. Not grief, not shame, fear. As the officers guided him toward the car, he twisted his head and shouted toward my house loud enough for every window. "This is because of you," he yelled. "You ungrateful—" "Enough," the detective said. I didn't step outside. I stayed behind the locked door, watching through the glass as the system moved faster than my father had planned. The detective turned to Darren. "You're going to email me everything he said. Texts, calls, escrow instructions, documents. Today." "Yes," Darren said quickly. "Yes, detective." Then the detective looked at my neighbor. "Ma'am," he said gently, "if you recorded anything, keep it. We may need a statement." She nodded, still stunned. My phone buzzed again. A message from my father sent seconds before they took his phone. "If you do this, I'll make sure you lose everything anyway." I screenshotted it and saved it. Threats don't scare me anymore. They document intent. The detective walked up to my porch and spoke through the glass. "We're moving fast now," he said. "We'll file an emergency action today to freeze any transfer. Do not open the door for anyone. Not a realtor, not a buyer, not a friend of your father." "I understand," I said. "If he contacts you from custody," he added, "don't answer. Save it." I nodded. As the patrol car drove away with my father inside, the street slowly returned to normal. Doors closed, curtains shifted. The performance was over. I locked the deadbolt again and leaned my forehead against the door. My father had cleared the mortgage to take the house. And in doing so, he'd finally stepped into a system that doesn't care how convincingly you lie. The house went quiet in a way it never had before. Not peaceful, not safe. Just empty of noise, like everything was holding its breath. I stayed exactly where the detective told me to stay. Door locked, curtains half drawn, lights off even though the sun was still up. My phone sat face down on the kitchen counter. I didn't need to look at it to know it would ring. An hour passed, then another. Patrol cars idled at the end of the street, just visible through the front window. Neighbors drifted back inside, curiosity, satisfied gossip already fermenting. I didn't move. At some point, the phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't my father. It was a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. A man's voice came through, tight and overly calm. "Ms. Hayes, this is Northbridge Escrow. We believe there may be a misunderstanding regarding the property. Please call us back as soon as possible so we can resolve this amicably." Amicably meant quietly. Before police reports, before courts, before paper trails hardened into charges. I saved the voicemail. 10 minutes later, another call. Same number. No voicemail this time. I blocked it. Then my phone buzzed again. A detention facility number. I didn't answer. The voicemail came through anyway. My father's voice sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it. Not apologetic, just inconvenienced. "They're treating me like a criminal," he whispered. "This is humiliating. You need to fix this. Tell them it was a mistake. You know I was just trying to help." I listened to the entire message once. Then I forwarded it to the detective and the title insurance attorney with a single line. Attempted contact from custody. I didn't cry. I didn't feel relief. I felt something colder than either. Distance. Late that evening, my phone rang again. This time it was the compliance officer from the lender. Her voice was clipped now, efficient, all warmth stripped away. "We pulled the Ron session data," she said. "The notarization was performed yesterday at 4:22 in the afternoon. We preserved the recording. Was it me?" I asked. "No," she replied without hesitation. "The person on the video is female, but the face is partially obscured due to lighting and camera angle." My chest tightened. "The credential check was completed using your social security number and a photograph of your driver's license," she continued. "The IP address traces to a residential network registered to your father." I closed my eyes. He hadn't just forged my signature. He had used my identity to pass a security check on video from inside his own house. "The originating phone number for the payoff verification call also matches him," she added, "and the payoff wire was initiated by Northbridge Escrow under a transfer file." "So everything ties back," I said. "Yes," she replied. "We've issued a formal fraud alert to the county recorder and the title platform. You'll receive a certified fraud packet with all audit data by tomorrow morning." "Thank you," I said. After the call ended, I sat at the kitchen table where my father had sat the day before and asked me to trust him. The chair was still slightly out of place. I didn't move it back. The next call came from my title insurance claims attorney. "We filed the emergency action," he said. "Temporary restraining order requested. Lis pendens filed. Lis pendens. A public scar on the property record that tells every title company one thing: stay away. Any attempt to sell or encumber the property is frozen," he continued. "Northbridge Escrow has been notified." "They called me," I said. "Of course they did," he replied. "They're scrambling." That night I slept on the couch with my phone on the coffee table and the lights on. Not because I was afraid my father would come back, because habits die slowly even when threats don't. The next morning the detective called. "We pulled the RO on recording," he said. "It's not you." I exhaled, not in relief, but in exhaustion. "We also subpoenaed the notary's journal and platform logs," he continued. "Margaret Lane's account shows the session originated from the same IP address your lender identified, same device fingerprint used to submit the quitclaim deed and the lien satisfaction. So it's linked," I said. "Completely," he replied, "and Northbridge Escrow Communications reference, getting it free and clear, and closing before she realizes." My hands went cold. "Your father was booked overnight," he said. "Charges are being filed." "What charges?" I asked. "Forgery, identity theft, filing a false instrument with the county recorder, attempted theft by deception, conspiracy given the coordination." I nodded slowly, even though he couldn't see it. "Is he being released?" I asked. "He was offered bail," the detective replied. The prosecutor argued flight risk and risk of continued harm. The judge imposed bail conditions and a no-contact order. He is not permitted to contact you or come within a specified distance of your home. The words settled over me like air returning to a sealed room. "And the notary?" I asked. "Emergency suspension of her commission," he said. "Formal charges pending. She's being interviewed today." "And escrow?" "We're serving them," he replied. "At minimum, they're witnesses. At worst, they're co-conspirators." After the call ended, I stood in my kitchen and looked around like I was seeing it for the first time. The counters, the door frames, the small scuff near the baseboard from the day I moved in. On paper, the house was mine again, not emotionally, legally. That afternoon, an email came in from Northbridge Escrow. Subject: transaction terminated. The body was brief, polite, bloodless. Due to an active fraud investigation, the transaction file has been canceled effective immediately. Canceled, not delayed, not rescheduled. Canceled. Another email followed from the realtor. I have provided law enforcement with all requested materials. I had no knowledge of the forgery. I'm very sorry this happened to you. I didn't reply. By evening, the house felt different. Not safer, not healed, just steadier. My father called once more from custody. I didn't answer. The voicemail came through anyway. "You're destroying this family," he said. "You'll regret this." I saved it, forwarded it, documented it, because regret wasn't what I felt. What I felt was the quiet certainty of standing still while someone else ran out of room. And for the first time since that envelope arrived, the house stopped feeling like something that could be taken from me in the dark. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. No grand pillars, no dramatic echo, just wood-worn carpet and the quiet weight of decisions being made every day without ceremony. I sat in the back row, hands folded in my lap, listening as my father's name was called like it belonged to a stranger. He didn't look at me when he entered. He kept his eyes forward, jaw set, posture stiff, with a kind of practiced dignity that fooled no one in that room. His lawyer leaned in and whispered something. My father nodded once the way he always did when he thought agreement equaled control. The prosecutor stood and began reading the charges. Forgery, identity theft, filing a false instrument, attempted theft by deception, conspiracy. Each word landed cleanly unemotional, stripped of family context. No one said father, no one said daughter. The law didn't care who raised who, it cared who signed what and who lied. The judge listened without expression, then asked the only question that mattered. Is there evidence supporting these charges? Yes, Your Honor, the prosecutor replied. Remote online notarization logs, video recordings. IP address matches, escrow communications, recorded deeds, and recorded attempts to contact the victim after arrest. My father's lawyer stood next. He talked about intentions, about confusion, about stress, about a parent trying to protect assets for the family. The judge didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. When the lawyer finished, the judge spoke calmly. Intent does not notarize forged signatures, he said. And family does not excuse fraud. The bail conditions were tightened. No contact, no proximity. Surrender of all copied identification. All devices submitted for forensic review. My father looked up, then finally eyes scanning the room until they landed on me. I didn't look away. The judge ordered him remanded briefly due to the violation of attempted contact. The gavel came down softly. Final enough. Outside the courtroom, I didn't wait for anyone. I didn't explain myself to relatives who suddenly wanted clarity. I walked straight out into the sunlight and breathed like someone who had been underwater longer than they realized. 2 days later, my attorney called. The corrective order has been recorded, she said. The fraudulent deed is voided pending final judgment. Title is restored to you. Restored. As if something borrowed had been returned. As if ownership could be paused and resumed without consequence. The lis pendens remains in place, she continued. No one can touch the property until this is fully resolved. I thanked her and hung up. Later that afternoon, I received the final packet from the county recorder. The quitclaim deed now bore a bold notation across the margin. Disputed. Voidable. Subject to court order. Paper can be cruel. It can also be precise. Northbridge Escrow sent a formal notice confirming the transaction file had been terminated due to fraud investigation. No apology, no admission, just distance. The notary's status update came through next. Commission revoked pending hearing. Charges filed. Multiple questionable notarizations under review. It turned out I wasn't the only one. The detective called that evening. We've connected additional files to the same notary account, he said. Similar patterns, same platform, same shortcuts. So this wasn't just about me, I said. No, he replied. It rarely is. That night my father called again from custody. The number came up automatically. I didn't answer. The voicemail arrived anyway. They're saying terrible things about me, he whispered. You know I didn't mean this. I just needed you to listen. You always make things harder than they need to be. I listened once. Then I saved it. Because what he still didn't understand was simple. Listening doesn't mean agreeing. And love doesn't require surrender. The following week I returned to my house after staying with a friend while patrol presence faded. The door opened the same way it always had. The air smelled familiar. Nothing inside had changed. And yet everything had. The house was no longer a bargaining chip, no longer a lever someone could pull. It was a structure held up by records, orders, and consequences. I changed the locks anyway. I installed cameras. Not out of fear, but out of clarity. The neighbor who had called the police stopped me one morning while I was taking out the trash. She apologized for not intervening sooner. "You did exactly what mattered," I told her. "You paid attention. The trial date was set. The evidence list grew thicker." My involvement shrank. That was the strangest part. The more the system took over, the less I had to carry. I wasn't responsible for the outcome. I was just responsible for telling the truth once. My father's narrative collapsed without an audience. His explanations didn't survive timestamps. His confidence didn't survive video logs. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. When the house finally went quiet again, truly quiet this time, I slept through the night without checking my phone. The walls didn't feel temporary anymore. They felt anchored. And I understood something I hadn't before. Revenge isn't loud. It isn't dramatic. It doesn't require confrontation. Sometimes it's just standing still long enough for the truth to catch up with the lie, and letting the record speak for itself. The silence after the hearing was different from the silence before it. Before it had been tense, watchful, like a room waiting for a door to open. After it settled into the house and stayed. Not warm, not gentle, just steady. I went back to work the next day. People there didn't know what had happened, not really. They asked if I was okay in the vague way people do when they sense something heavy but don't want details. I told them I was fine because, in a way, I was. The chaos had stopped. The damage had been named. The rest belonged to the system now. At lunch, my phone buzzed. A message from my aunt. "Your father is devastated. He says you've abandoned him." I read it once and put the phone face down on the table. Devastated was a word people used when consequences arrived without apology. That evening, I met with my attorney again. Not for court, for cleanup. "We're going to be thorough," she said, sliding a checklist across the desk. "Credit freeze, identity monitoring, affidavits to all major bureaus. You'll also want to update your estate documents." I nodded. "Everything. Everything." She replied, "When someone crosses this line, you assume they may try again in a different form. We reviewed timelines, evidence, the prosecution strategy, the likelihood of a plea versus trial. He's facing serious exposure," she said carefully, "especially with the recorded attempts to contact you after arrest." I didn't ask if she thought he'd be convicted. That question wasn't mine to carry. "What happens to the house during all this?" I asked. "It stays frozen," she said. "No sale, no transfer, no leverage." That word again. Leverage. I went home and walked through each room slowly. The bedroom, the hallway, the small spare room I'd always meant to turn into something else. For years, the house had felt provisional, like something I had to keep justifying, keep protecting, keep earning. Now it didn't. A letter arrived a few days later from the county recorder confirming the corrective order. The fraudulent deed was officially flagged, annotated, and isolated in the chain of title. Future examiners would see it and stop. That was the power of record. It didn't erase what happened. It made sure it couldn't be repeated quietly. The detective called again at the end of the week. "We've identified additional communications between your father and the escrow company," he said. "Emails, texts, instructions about speed and discretion." "Does it matter?" I asked. "It matters," he replied. "It establishes intent, pattern, planning." "Will I need to testify?" I asked. "Possibly," he said. But much of this speaks for itself. After the call, I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the chair where my father had sat the day he asked me to put the house in his name. I could still see it. His hands folded, his voice calm, his certainty that I'd give in eventually. He had never imagined a version of me that didn't. Another message arrived from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. Families shouldn't do this to each other. I typed a response, deleted it. Typed another, deleted that too. Then I put the phone down and didn't answer at all. Because families shouldn't forge signatures either. And if we were going to talk about lines, we should talk about all of them. A week later, my father's lawyer requested a mediated conversation. My attorney asked if I wanted to consider it. No, I said without hesitation. She nodded. That's wise. What would he want, I asked. To negotiate narrative, she replied. To soften record. To regain control. I almost laughed. Control had been the currency from the beginning, and he had spent it all. The trial date drew closer. Motions were filed. Evidence lists expanded. The notary's case progressed separately, tangled but unmistakably linked. I received an update that her commission was formally revoked. Permanently. The idea that she might never notarize another document again gave me no satisfaction. It just felt correct. One afternoon, a package arrived from my father's house. No return note, just a box. Inside were old photographs, childhood things, items I hadn't seen in years, a peace offering maybe, or a reminder, or a test. I put the lid back on and slid the box into the closet without opening anything else. Some things don't need interpretation. The house began to feel quieter in a new way, not emptied of threat but cleared of intrusion. I replaced the last of the locks, updated the alarm, changed the passwords I hadn't thought about in years. Each small action felt like reclaiming territory that had always been mine but never entirely secure. One night I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and watched the streetlights flicker on. The same neighbors passed by. The same dogs barked. The same world continued. What had changed wasn't visible. It was structural. My father's voice no longer lived in the walls. His expectations no longer shaped my decisions. His approval no longer hovered over every boundary I set. The system had done what confrontation never could. It had drawn a line he couldn't cross without consequence. When my phone buzzed again, it was my attorney. They're discussing a plea, she said. Nothing final yet. I closed my eyes. Whatever happened next, it would be public, recorded, irreversible. And for the first time, that didn't scare me. Because the house wasn't just a house anymore. It was proof. Proof that ownership means nothing without consent. That authority dissolves when it's exposed to daylight. That the quietest form of revenge is letting the truth stand unedited. And I was done editing my life to make someone else comfortable. The plea deal came through on a Tuesday morning. Not with drama, not with warning. Just a call from my attorney while I was making coffee, the kettle already screaming by the time she got to the point. He's agreed, she said. Forgery, filing a false instrument, identity theft, conspiracy reduced in exchange for cooperation. I turned the stove off and sat down. What does that mean for me? I asked. It means you won't have to testify, she replied. And it means the record is settled. Settled. Finalized. No appeal to family narrative. No rewriting. And sentencing, I asked. There will be jail time, she said carefully, not symbolic, not suspended, and a permanent criminal record. I closed my eyes, not because I needed a moment, but because the words deserved space. Okay, I said. After the call ended, I didn't cry. I didn't celebrate. I poured the coffee I'd already made and drank it standing at the counter looking at the wall like it might change. It didn't. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with messages I didn't answer. Relatives, family friends, people who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly found opinions they needed to share. He's still your father. This didn't need to go this far. You'll regret this when he's gone. I didn't reply to any of it. Because the thing they didn't understand was simple. It had already gone that far. I had just refused to follow it there. The official notice arrived a few days later. Court seal, thick paper, no adjectives, just facts. The fraudulent deed was permanently voided, the chain of title restored and affirmed, no claims pending, no ambiguity remaining. My name stood alone where it always should have. I framed that page and hung it inside the hall closet, not because I needed to see it every day, but because I wanted to know exactly where it was if I ever needed it again. The detective called once more to close the loop. He cooperated, he said, provided communications, timelines, confirmed intent. And the escrow company, I asked. They're facing regulatory review, he replied. At minimum. Their license status is under scrutiny. And the notary, I asked. Charges filed, he said. She'll never practice again. I thanked him and ended the call. It struck me then how quiet the process had been at the end. No shouting, no confrontation, no final argument where someone realizes they're wrong. Just paperwork. Just consequences. My father called one last time before sentencing. The number came through as restricted. I didn't answer. The voicemail was shorter than the others. His voice was flat. "They say you won," he said. "I hope it was worth it." I deleted the message. Winning implies a contest. This wasn't one. That night I walked through the house slowly, touching the door frames, the walls, the corners I'd painted myself. I remembered how proud I'd been the day I closed, standing in the empty living room with the keys heavy in my palm. I remembered the photo my father had looked away from when he sat at my table and asked me to give it up. I understood something now that I hadn't then. He hadn't been asking for the house. He'd been asking for permission to erase me. The sentencing happened without me present. My attorney attended. I stayed home. I didn't need to watch it. The outcome arrived in an email later that afternoon. Months of incarceration, restitution, permanent no-contact order. When I read it, I felt nothing sharp, no satisfaction, no grief, just alignment. A week later, I ran into my neighbor at the grocery store. She hugged me awkwardly, then pulled back. "I'm glad you're okay," she said. "I am," I replied. And for the first time, it wasn't a lie. The house felt different now. Not because the threat was gone, but because the story was finished. There was no cliffhanger, no unresolved tension humming in the background, just walls that belonged to me, just silence that didn't wait for a voice to break it. I donated the box of childhood things my father had sent. I kept nothing. Some people call that cold. I call it clean. On a quiet evening near the end of the month, I sat on the floor of the living room with the windows open and the lights off, listening to the city breathe. Cars passed. Someone laughed down the block. Life continued. And I realized something I hadn't expected. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had done its job. It had alerted me. It had sharpened me. It had kept me from freezing when everything tried to move without my consent. But it didn't need to stay. What stayed instead was something sturdier. Boundaries that didn't need explaining. Ownership that didn't require approval. A record that didn't care how persuasive someone sounded. I had learned that love without respect is just leverage. That family doesn't get a discount on accountability. That the most dangerous lies are the ones told softly with concern. And I had learned that you don't need revenge when the truth is documented. Because the system doesn't remember feelings. It remembers facts. And my name finally was the only one attached to what was mine. The morning after everything became final, I woke up without checking my phone. No alerts, no missed calls. No messages waiting to pull me back into a story that no longer belonged to me. Sunlight came through the kitchen window and landed on the counter where that envelope had sat weeks ago. The one with the bold line that changed everything. I stood there for a moment, not replaying it, not rewriting it, just letting it exist as something that had already happened. The house felt ordinary again. Not empty, not haunted, just mine. I went about my day slowly. Made breakfast, answered emails, watered the plant by the window that had almost died while my attention was elsewhere. Small acts, quiet acts, the kind that don't feel like recovery until you realize you're doing them without effort. Later, I opened the hall closet and looked at the framed court document hanging inside. The corrective order. My name. The finality of it. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt settled. People sometimes ask what revenge looks like when it isn't loud, when it isn't dramatic, when there's no final speech or slam door or last confrontation where someone admits they were wrong. This is what it looks like. A house that stays standing, a record that doesn't bend, a boundary that holds even when the person pushing against it used to tuck you in at night. I didn't lose a parent that day. I lost an illusion. The illusion that love excuses harm, that blood erases accountability, that staying quiet keeps the peace. Peace that requires your silence isn't peace, it's permission. The consequences weren't mine to create. I didn't choose the charges. I didn't choose the sentence. I didn't choose how far it went. I chose one thing. I chose not to undo the truth once it was exposed. And that choice changed everything. In the weeks that followed, life didn't magically improve. There were still awkward holidays, still relatives who avoided my eyes, still moments when the old instinct to explain myself